Good morning and welcome to our Landor LINKS ZatPark sponsored webinar this morning. Apologies for the very slight delay, technical difficulties, funnily enough. This morning we're going to be talking about the topic of parking permits across the country. We'll be focusing mainly on the transition from paper to digital permits, which solves many problems and also presents many challenges. We'll be considering the use of permits in the context of both curbside and car park management. This encompasses residential, business, workplace and service vehicles, and we have an expert panel to help navigate us through this. I'll come on to them in a minute. Again, if I can just thank Landor LINKS and ZatPark for their sponsorship, and perhaps just give you a bit of background. My experience of permits started many years ago, living and working in London. I remember I had to go to Kensington and Chelsea Town Hall. I had to take various bits of paper, driving license, birth certificate, both grandparents that were still alive, etc. Queue up for hours, be scrutinised by somebody behind a desk, and if I was very lucky, maybe a month later, I would get a paper permit. This permit would then sit in my car, would quite often get blown away, lost, stolen, etc. And probably wasn't a very efficient system for me or for the council. Things have obviously moved on since then. We have digital permits that you can apply for online. All sorts of scrutiny is done in the back office, and lots of organisations and companies can provide those services. So today we're going to be talking about the evolution and curbside management and parking and permits. We have 3 people on the panel today. The first person to speak is Tina Glover. Tina and I first met I reminded her this morning, 20 odd years ago, when she was parking manager for Bury Council. Tina is a highly experienced traffic management and parking engineering professional with a broad range of knowledge in the industry, from project management and consultation through to delivery and design. Tina was a former group leader for traffic, transportation and parking services, road safety at Bury Council, and has experience in leading multidisciplinary teams with over 22 years of public service. I'm actually not going to read the rest of her bio because it's all very impressive. But prior to this, we were just talking, and she also told me she's a half triathlete, but I'm sure she can expand on that when she talks. So I'm going to hand over to Tina to start the conversation. Please do remember to post your questions in the question box for the end. You don't have to wait till the final speaker. If you put them in there, I can start looking at them and sorting through them. And we'd very much like to hear from you all. So Tina, if I could hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Gavin, and welcome everybody. Thanks for bigging me up on that. I'm a half marathon runner. I'm not sure triathlons are really my thing, and when I say runner, more of a jog, but I get through them. So welcome everybody, and today I'm going to be talking about the pros and cons of a paper permit system. Today is my daughter's 16th birthday, as it happens, and in her world, Snapchat and Insta are king. If she doesn't get her Snapchat streaks in, then her world ends. Now, if you're my age and old, you might have to Google what that actually means, but I'll let you do that separately. So if we can just go ahead. Can I ask for the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay. So, has the traditional way of enforcing permit schemes become obsolete? You know, we live in a world of smartphones. I've just mentioned my daughter, contactless payments and ever-evolving technology. And digital innovation has fundamentally changed the world as we know it. So we've got to ask the question, in today's world, is there still a need for paper permit systems? Is it time to shred the paper and go fully virtual? So a large number of local authorities and companies have already done this. So we've got to ask the question, what is deterring others from making that transition? Can I have the next slide, please? So before I go into the pros and cons, I just thought I'd put some basic stats really around this. And it was really interesting when I was looking into this, that in 2020, it was recorded that 59% of the world's population are now online. Now, I don't know what everybody else's thoughts are around this, but to me, I expected that figure to be a lot higher than it is. that only represents just over half the population. So in context, that means that there's an awful lot of people out there that still aren't using the access or aren't accessing the internet. Okay, so having said that, it's clear that digital innovation is key and people are investing in it, companies are still investing in it. So there was a research that was carried out by IFS, a global enterprise software provider, and that showed that despite the current economic uncertainty, there are many companies still investing in digital transformation. And if we just look at the splits, that 75% of companies in construction plan to increase spending, 58% of IT companies have the same plans, and 55% of manufacturing businesses also have plans. So I don't think it's in question that the future success of parking relies heavily on continued investment in digital innovation. But where does that leave traditional methods of operating and enforcing? I think in order to answer that, we need to look at the benefits and the disadvantages that are associated with the paper system. So without doubt, let's take a look at what those are. So the first one for benefits has got to be inclusivity. I just mentioned in my previous slide that only just over half of the population have internet access, and most digital systems clearly require customers to log on and be responsible for their accounts. And for some customers, this can be a barrier because they don't have internet access, or for those that do have internet access, they don't have the competence to navigate online portals. So number two, the visual aspect. What do I mean by visual aspect? I mean the customer receives something tangible. So paper permit systems produce paper. Here's an example here, one I prepared earlier, Blue Peter fashion, and this is actually an old permit produced by Bury Council. But for some customers, especially when a fee is being charged, there's an expectation of receiving an end product. Of course, the reality is that end product could be virtual. But I think this point is particularly relevant when it comes to a topic like permit parking. One of the biggest objections to permit parking schemes is having to pay for a permit. A number of years ago, I can recall when I was project managing the introduction of a virtual residence permit scheme for a local council. And at the time, there was a lot of doubt from one particular zone. And their concerns were around the virtual aspects of that scheme. So to set the public's minds at ease, I organised a public meeting and I met with members of the public. And at one point during that meeting, I began to explain the benefits of the virtual system and explain that the system would work in the same way as the paper system had worked for residents' vehicles. The only change would be that they didn't need to display a physical permit, as the handheld computers that the CEOs carried contained the registration numbers. So I went on to say that whilst we could continue to go to the expense of printing and posting out the permits, the piece of paper was worthless, as the vehicle was covered from the minute the registration details were added to the system. And I'll never forget the response from that resident who stood up in the meeting on that day and said to me, "I've paid for a permit, so that's what I expect to receive." And that means they needed something tangible to feel that they were getting something for what they paid for. So it's a really interesting point, I think, and it's sometimes overlooked. So number three, simplicity, control. Paper permits on the main are usually, they're usually easier to control and more simple to introduce. There's less people using them. Back office staff are controlling how the paper permits are put together, how they're printed and how they're sent out. With an online virtual system, the customer is more in control, but that means there's more users using that system. And if that's customers who aren't very familiar with using the internet, then it becomes more complicated. IT glitch free. So this is quite relevant, I think. I'm sure we can all think of a moment where IT has failed us. In my particular case, I can think of lots of occasions, but to be honest, it's probably the user rather than the IT itself. But the point I'm making is, technology is great until it stops working, or the internet doesn't work, it buffers, we can't see people. Good old-fashioned paper doesn't need to be concerned with that. It continues to function, providing, of course, it's been displayed in the first place, but that's a whole different debate. So let's have a look at what the disadvantages of a paper permit system are. So the first one on top of the list has got to be operational costs. In every single virtual permit system business case, within that, near the top, will be the savings that you can achieve through introducing that type of system. It stands to reason paper permit systems are costly to operate. They need the piece of paper that I showed you before, and that's not just a normal piece of paper. That's a piece of paper with a little nice foiled edge there. It's perforated so that it easily tears out of the sheet of paper that it comes in. It's specially prepared. Alongside that, it needs posting, it needs delivering, it needs renewal letters every time that that piece of paper needs renewing. None of that's needed with a virtual system, and all of those elements add up to costs. Number 2, permit abuse. So when you have a paper permit like this, my prop that's going to keep coming out all the way through this presentation, but when you have a paper permit like the one in my hand, it has 2 registration numbers, which obviously have blanked out on this occasion. But that's quite straightforward. I know that that piece of paper relates to a certain vehicle. When it comes to visitors permits, what do? I may have 20 different type vehicle visitors visiting me if I'm popular. And in those occasions, I don't know who they're going to be. So I can't get a paper permit that has a registration number on each of those. So clearly, a lot of the visitors permits are blank. And that's where the problem arises. I remember a scheme I worked on quite a few years ago, which was located near a hospital. And within 6 months of us implementing that scheme, we were getting calls from some of the residents to say that other residents had sold on their visitors permits to nurses and doctors working at the hospital, because there's no registration associated to it. So it makes it more open to abuse. Number 3, resource heavy. So it stands to reason that with a virtual system, the customer's in control, which is obviously a benefit for a virtual system. They're responsible, they can control it. With a paper system, it relies on more back office staff to be able to administer that. And again, that comes back, we're back to costs again. Everything comes down to a cost. Number 4, lack of flexibility. So back to my prop again. Here's my paper permit. Here's my paper permit with my vehicle registration number on it. I've just changed my car, so now I need to change that piece of paper. In a virtual system, that's very easy to do. I log on, I change my registration number, and it's live straight away. With this, I need to speak to parking services. I need to request a new paper permit. I need the CEO to cover my vehicle so that I don't get a parking ticket while I'm waiting for my new permit to arrive. It's not a flexible scheme. There's other issues with back office staff making typo errors when they're actually producing the permits. So the flexibility just isn't there with a paper permit system as it is with a virtual system. So I think that's a quick run through of what the advantages and disadvantages are. But I think we really need to look at considerations, regardless of what type of scheme you're looking to introduce, whether that's going from a paper permit system and transitioning to a virtual system, or whether that's looking at introducing new systems and deciding what type they're going to be. I think there's 4 key points really that need considering. The first one has got to be clear policies. Are your parking policies and your residents' parking strategies, are they clear? Do you communicate what you're going to be doing in those documents? And do they link to your wider company visions or council visions or local plans? Whatever you're doing, it has to have early engagement and communication if you want to get it right. And this is so important. Engaging with your customers. What do they want? And that links into listening to them too. What do they want? You may have a vision of what you want to introduce, and that may be a fully digital vision. It may be a paper system, although that's highly unlikely as time progresses. But you need to listen to what the customer wants, and you need to work in partnership to overcome those barriers. So what are their concerns? Why, if they're averse to a digital system, why is that? Do they feel they can't use it? Can you do something to get around that? And can you work with them? And if you follow those 4 key points, then you will be able to introduce a successful scheme, whether that's a paper system or whether it's a virtual system. And that ends my little chat for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. My details are on this slide now. If anybody wants to have a chat with me at any point, obviously just drop me an email and I'll be in the discussion at the end of this. But if you need any support on introducing permit schemes, or you just want to have a discussion about anything that I've spoken about. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tina. As you know, when we first met, I was an operations manager, so I do find it fascinating, the actual kind of mechanics of running a parking operation from a local authority point of view. I now know obviously you're with the project centre, but I know you advise specifically Bury, but many other local authorities on the operation. So I would encourage anybody to contact Tina if they do need any help with things. I'm very much kind of also interested in the social inclusion aspect of permits. And being IT challenged myself, or technically challenged myself, I do sometimes struggle with downloading the right document in which format, whether it's a PDF or that's actually the extent of my knowledge, whether it's a PDF or something else.
Mine too.
And I do like to hold something, and I like to sort of see what I'm buying, so to speak. Yeah, so I think it would be good if we could come back to that maybe at the end, and I can see some questions coming in. So yeah, thank you very much, Tina. Really interesting. And we'll come back to you at the end. We have had one request though, Tina. I know you've gone now, but perhaps when you come back on, if you could show people the permit slightly closer to the camera. Somebody would like to see what it actually looks like. Probably some youngster who has never had one. It's all digital for them. So, there's a bit of history for them.
It's to be framed in a museum soon.
They will be. Thank you. So now, thank you, Tina. We're now going to move on to Neil. Neil and I also met 20 odd years ago. I think it was in Sunderland, but I'm sure Neil's memory is better than mine. He will correct me. Neil is the founder of founder and CEO of Grid Smarter Cities. And Grid recently picked up national awards for innovation, intelligent parking from numerous agencies, the ITS UK Awards, British Parking Awards, and the North East Times Impact Awards. And Neil was also named Innovator of the Year in 2018. Neil is a named inventor for 15 granted transport and mobility patents and has led Grid on a number of successful innovation UK-funded projects, developing new propositions in the smart city space. He has been opening up the innovation export opportunities for Grid in the UK, and most recently as part of the UK Pavilion as the ITS World Congress in Hamburg. He goes on to say, and again, I'm not going to read it all, that he's been all over the world, and every time he and I bump into each other, he is either off somewhere or has just got back from somewhere. I remember talking to Neil about Grid years and years ago when he first came up with the idea, and was sort of baffled then as to how it would work. And I personally have become a believer, an absolute believer in what Neil's trying to do, and have had many late nights discussing it with him over the years in various hotels across the country. So I will pass over to Neil, a slightly different angle from him, and I'm sure it will be very informative. So perhaps, Neil, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and good morning to everyone. Yes, it's taken 10 years or so to become an overnight success, Kevin. And here I am sitting in another hotel room for another meeting with another potential enabler. Morning, everyone. Reinvent deliveries, looking at the digital permission at the curbside and the dynamic curb space. And this webinar is quite timely because it comes off the back of a Centre for London Worth the Wait report, looking at establishing greener and more sustainable deliveries in the centre of London for the future. And one of the key recommendations to Transport for London and to London boroughs was the adoption and embracing of digital and dynamic curbside management, the better use of the curb space, effectively allowing operators, freight servicing and delivery operators, a better access to what effectively is a scarce resource that's becoming increasingly scarcer with more pedestrianisation, cycle lanes, and other areas of impact on the curb space. So the amount of area for deliveries, and with the growth in online deliveries, there are massive demands on that curb space. So what we've looked to do is to turn that piece of curb space from a two-dimensional asset into a three-dimensional flexible piece of real estate. And we're concentrating on the commercial sector, the freight service and delivery sector in the first instance, because they have critical needs. And if we want the cafe culture, we've got to allow the coffee and the croissants to be delivered to the restaurants, the beer to the pubs, and the food to the restaurants. And the more we need those goods delivered, the more impact it is on the curb space. Next slide, please. And we understand, after working with the industry for over 10, 15 years, that the curb space for each one of the operators has a different and nuanced need, whether it be construction, delivering cement, delivering goods, whether it be parcel deliveries, which is not so curbside critical as something like the brewery logistics, which delivering 70-kilogram kegs of beer to pubs is really difficult. From a health and safety perspective, you need to be outside that premises that you're delivering to, whereas with parcels it's not as acute. Chilled and frozen goods, there are health and safety requirements, and service and maintenance vehicles, the plumbers, the joiners, the lift fridge engineers all need access to the curb, and the curb at the moment is not really fit for purpose. There is not enough loading provision, servicing provision available at the curb. So what we've done is looked at all of the nuanced curbside needs and developed a platform which can embrace operational solutions, digital permits for each one of the operators to access the curb in the particular way that they need access to the curb. Next slide, please. And the platform we've developed is quite simple. It's an enabling tool to allow the curb owners to make available the curb space and the operators to access the curb space. And like I say, for brewery logistics, it may well be that they need to be outside the pub for 40 minutes and need the guaranteed slot outside the pub. And we've created the concept of the virtual loading bay, where we can effectively lift the restriction for that class of vehicle to be at that location at a particular time, linked in with the civil enforcement officer's handheld, so that whitelisted vehicle is permitted to be there at a certain time. And the other thing that we've started to look at and start to develop is the bookable bay, so taking a physical loading bay and turning it into a permit bay. And that permit bay can be used for loading on a morning, it could be parcel deliveries on an afternoon, and it could even be a street dining area in the evening. So it gives the flexibility of the local authority to dynamically manage the curb space and create an optimal use. And it obviously makes sense as you try to migrate the vehicle fleets into transition to EV, that you allow the creation of rapid charges and infrastructure to be placed where vehicles are going to dwell. So if you've got a big truck doing a 40-minute delivery, it makes sense that that vehicle can graze across the network and not do a full top-up, but just gradually increase the amount of charge it can have in extending the range of that delivery vehicle. Next slide, please. And what we've done to accompany the physical bays, the bookable bays, we've brought in and introduced a smart sign as well. So you can see the authorised permit holder, regulatory plate there, and there's an advisory plate that will sit beneath it with the booking instructions for the vehicles that are turning for the curb space during the day. We've tested and trialled the zonal permits, the virtual loading bays and the bookable bays in a number of areas. The latest one that we had was Amersfoort in the Netherlands, where it was used as a loading bay on a morning, used for cargo bags in an afternoon, and then the local restaurant put tables and chairs out in the evening after booking a 4-hour slot. So that's, I'll look forward to questions, but we are moving towards the requirement that the curb space, with it now being a scarce piece of real estate, needs to be better and more dynamically managed. And the way we do that is through digitalisation and permit process. And happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. Again, I sort of understood it, as you and I have had many conversations. Something I'd perhaps like to come back to in the question panel when James has done his presentation is, I remember discussing with you or one of your partners about the traffic regulation orders and the local authorities' resistance to perhaps changing them or understanding how to change them to make a residence bay a loading bay. I think we'll come back to it, Neil, because I know you want to answer, but if perhaps you could have a think about that and how you've overcome that or discussed that with some of your local authorities. And I know you're working in partnership and doing trials with some of them, so perhaps some, not too detailed, but a bit more detail on that we could come back to. I personally would be very interested in that. So thanks, Neil. We're now, again, if I can just remind you all, there's certain questions coming through, but if you could just keep putting them in the question box so that I can start sifting through them. before James comes on. So unlike the other two, James and I only met a couple of years ago. James is one of the product specialists working with me at ZatPark, and has been involved in the industry for coming up 4 to 5 years now. James at the moment works predominantly with our private parking operators, but is moving into the local authority area. And James implements the ZatPark software and our solutions, which help our private and public sector clients with their processes, and on occasions they drive revenue growth. James is also a UK representative at Bowls, not triathlon, definitely Bowls. And those of you that have followed my LinkedIn process will see that I beat him over the summer. So I'm a UK Bowls beating champion myself. But I'll let James tell you all about that. So James, if I can hand over to you for your presentation.
Hello, how's it going? Yeah, one thing you'll notice from this presentation is I'm certainly not a graphic designer, but what I do actually do is to try and help local authorities and operators get the best out of their systems. So mine is going to be covering how to choose the right permit system, basically. If we can move to the next slide, please. So firstly, what impact has COVID had on technology? Now, essentially, it has digitalized a lot of industries, and it's not just the parking sector. So a little story, but I went to the cinema recently, used an online booking system, paid for the tickets, and obviously was provided with my e-tickets that I could store within the wallet on my iPhone. When I turned up, I simply scanned the cards and went straight on through. So now, in comparison, I remember not so long ago having to stand in a long queue to buy tickets, and obviously that's at the same time as everybody else was buying all their tickets, their drinks and snacks. And as a person who really hates queuing, I found it pretty tedious. Going back to the cinema post-COVID/lockdown, it's a perfect example of an industry that's adapted because of the requirement to do so. And it wasn't even that big of a change. It was simply just a change in the way you purchase your tickets, not too difficult from permits. So there was a recent survey which was conducted by the Confederation of British Industry in July this year. It was found that 60% of businesses had adopted new digital technologies, and that's based around things like remote working, cloud computing, obviously having to have that access, and nearly 40% invested in new digital capabilities such as e-commerce changes, so how to pay for things and it all going digital, and as well as that it's new systems as well. A separate study from that found that a majority of the respondents from the survey, so that's 90%, stated that the pandemic prompted or accelerated these changes, and that they'll keep the new practices going forward. Fundamentally, the technology shift will have a massive impact on the general customer as a whole. That's not just within parking, that's within everything. And their experience, obviously, when dealing with a business or local authority is due to change massively. So next slide, please. How does it affect the world of permits? So what relevance does COVID, etc., have to permits? Well, it's time for the industry to follow suit and ensure parking and permit application is in the 21st century. Digitalization, very important, and it is absolutely safe to say that the paper and physical permits are slowly dying. That COVID has been a contributing factor. Obviously, there will be exceptions where physical permits and local authorities feel, they're still required. For example, you have your elderly who are not as computer literate. You have those that don't have access to computers, smartphone, or the internet. There's also certain permit types that still require a physical presence. So these tend to differ across different local authorities, but with systems now having the functionality to digitize a lot of these permit types, local authorities are starting to review these clunky processes and identify ways to make them more efficient. And the way that jumps out the most is to remove these physical-based permits. Another obvious aspect is that it's more eco-friendly. If you think of the trees, the agenda of growing green is constantly progressing in day-to-day life. Businesses and LAs are proactively looking to do all they can, no matter how small it is, and therefore it's a win-win, as digitizing is obviously a lot more cost-effective, and there is a requirement, you don't have that requirement to waste resources where unnecessary. The end user journey, again, very important. The permits need to be easily accessible, and the process of applying for them should be seamless. With a lot of permit types becoming digitized, motorists will be relying on the system capabilities of LAs and car parking operators, as it's not just receiving a permit in the post and displaying it in your car anymore. Therefore, application needs to be simple to avoid problems further down the line, as such as receiving a PCN. Historically, local authorities and operators would be renowned for accepting permit applications and managing permits through the post, which is now becoming an outdated and painful process for both the end user and the recipient. For me personally, I'd be more than happy if I never had to post anything again, because we now live in a world where a stamp and an envelope are just as difficult to get hold of than an internet connection. And with this rapid advancement of technology, it does mean more and more people are becoming familiar with IT-based solutions, whether it's through a mobile application, a website, scanning barcodes, whatever. So yes, COVID has helped progress the average person's ability to navigate tech-based solutions. And I promise I'm not just picking on the elderly when I say this, but the majority of the audience will now and should now expect an internet-based process to apply for permits. So both local authority and private parking sector have loads of different permit types available, as we all know. And by digitising a majority of these permit types, there will obviously be changes on how to apply for them, who can apply, how to display them, and obviously which apps to have downloaded. It's also very likely new permit types will start popping up as well. So if you have a system with an advanced configuration when creating tariffs, it's likely there'll soon be permit types within permit types. When deciding which permits would work best in certain areas, it's very important to understand what type of technology is needed. Different permits operate better than others in certain car parks and locations, and there is a responsibility from the local authority or parking operator in understanding the solutions they provide and how the end user is going to benefit and encounter a positive experience when looking to park. Advancements. So with the industry continuously evolving, depending on the latest technology, it is important that solutions in place can align with these advancements. We're far past of having an on-premise box in the corner of a room with a single server keeping an entire operator or local authority afloat. Systems, predominantly follow the SaaS model now, orientated and, allows new features and updates to be added regularly. And this leads me nicely on to my next slide. Thank you. So, how to choose the right permit solution. Has there ever been a better time to review your permit solution? I don't think there has been, but I've worked with both local authorities and private parking operators and had many discussions about having that system refresh, due to these outdated processes. From these conversations, I basically just concluded a list of what they believe to be the most desired. So the system needs to have a stern and resilient infrastructure. A permit system will typically store large volumes of personal data, so it needs to be impenetrable. Obvious abuse of data protection and GDPR guidelines can lead to detrimental to any operator or LA and could easily carry heavy consequences. SaaS, so software as a service, works through the cloud delivery model. A software provider will typically host the application and other related data using its own servers, databases, networks, hardware, and the application will essentially be accessible to any device with a network connection. Beauty of this is that any updates, any new features, and any changes to the industry can happen seamlessly without any disruption to everyday activity. It also allows the ability to work anywhere, anytime, so it very much complements remote working. With the vast number of different permit types being available, there needs to be a detailed level of configuration available when setting them up. So things like your duration and dates, your pricing, renewals, allocation limits, discounts, emission charges, a list goes on. But they all need to be very customizable, and they also each require verification methods too. So ensuring the applicant has to upload the relevant information in order to grant them access to the permit. At the end of the day, accurate applications simply help avoid misuse and fraudulent behavior. The end user journey. So the applicant will need to be able to easily navigate the web browser or mobile application in order to request permits to park. Can't stress enough how important it is to have a clean interface. If you don't, it can lead to an increase in complaints and obviously a drop in revenue because nobody's able to park. The system needs to be scalable, so it doesn't need to be redesigned to maintain an effective performance during or after a steep increase in workload. This is very typical nowadays with a SaaS model, but obviously having a supplier that can provide it is very important. Under one roof, so the system needs to have and be able to house all different permit types, as well as facilitating the internal processes that the LA and operators follow. It saves you having to create ad hoc processes externally to the system, and therefore having a separate area that logs personal data. If you're having to jump between systems, then your current system may not be the right one for you. It's as simple as that. Efficiency, keeping administration levels down will allow staff to be even more productive with their time. It also ensures permits as a whole are running smoothly for the actual permit holder. Any delays and issues can have that knock-on effect for the motorists, and therefore they're going to have a bad experience. Finally, we have support. So essentially using a provider with great support ensures any issues or questions are dealt with quickly and professionally. Supporting a migration from a legacy system to a shiny new system shouldn't be as scary as it sounds. Trust between the provider and the local authority or the operator should lead to concluding a project initiation document to ensure everyone is on the same page and delivery goes smoothly. And essentially, that's the James Hampton guide on how to select a permit system in 2021. Thank you for all your time, and hopefully we'll get some questions soon. Back to Gavin.
Thanks, James. Yeah, very interesting. And we have got lots of questions coming in. As I said, please, guys, please do keep sending them in, and we are picking them off as they do. I'm hopeful the panelists will appear in front of me on screen, and then we can start going through some of the questions that have come in. I'm hoping Neil's going to appear, because the first one, Neil, I think is a really simple one. And thank you, Caroline Hasty, for sending it in. She would like some more information on the smart digital sign. And Caroline asks, does this enable a local authority or a private car park to put instant tariffing messages on a sign? Is there a delay? Perhaps it's just a sort of 30 seconds explanation as to what that is, please.
It's an instance. So we've got the regulatory plate above, which is permit only, permit holders only. Can you hear me? Permit holders only, and underneath is an advisory plate, which is adaptable and changeable in real time. So when a booking changes, it'll adjust. It's in e-ink digital sign, so similar to the way some of the bus signs are used, and it can change in real time with the bookings that are there. And you can put advisory information. You can also put local community information on there as well. We're designing a 3-sided sign as well to go with the regulatory plate as well. That's currently being demonstrated at a UCL test lab.
Okay, thank you. One question for me, actually. I think this is probably for all of you, so you can decide who takes it first. Perhaps Tina, you would go first. But I remember years ago talking to Roger Woodward, who was is a consultant for Croydon, and he was talking about his journey from home to work, and he had a permit to park outside his house. He would then have to pay for the Dartford crossing or the tunnel, and then he'd get to work and he'd have a permit for his work car park, and he'd want to do his dry cleaning at lunchtime. You know, the usual sort of conversations I know we've all had. A question I have, but has also come in from somebody, is does a panel see at any point a one permit covers all provision from a service provider, so that I don't have to keep logging in or out? I think very, very similar to the question I think we all have about cashless parking, or I think you understand the point. So Tina, do you, from a sort of Greater Manchester point of view, is that something that you could see happening?
I'd like to think so at some point in the future. I think the difficulty you have is that it's getting all the different systems to talk to each other. Now, I'm not a techie person at all by any stretch, but having experienced quite a number of different exchanges of data migration and different parking systems, when through the renewal of new parking enforcement contracts, and you see new suppliers, and you deal with the migration of one system to another system. I think you start to understand that actually in this day and age it should be really simple to be able to do that, but I'm not sure it always is. From a local authority perspective, the difficulty arises in sharing that information and data with the third party and external companies, because even if you just look, if you look at, you know, if we take it in simple terms of paper permit systems, where internally trying to operate different types of paper permit systems, whether that's residence permit zones, staff zones, and then contract parking for on your car parks, you've got 3 types there within. Now, technically, in a council, that won't always be administered or set up by the same departments. It won't always come through a parking services department. It's highly likely that the residence parking schemes will, and those permits, back to the Blue Peter from earlier, those will come, they will be generated from your back office system. If you then look at staff permits, they possibly may go through your parking team, but it's highly likely that they haven't been, the actual scheme isn't administered from the parking services team. It's probably a corporate initiative. And you already have a problem there that unless you give access to your back office, it's your parking services team that have to administer it, but it's not actually instigated by them, and they're not then able to deal with all the queries that arise from it. So there's a lot of complications like that. But with regards to the technology, clearly it has to be a virtual solution. You can't do it in a paper format, I don't think. And I think probably Neil and James are probably able to answer whether they think we're closer to that or not.
Thank you. Yes, it's interesting you should mention that about different departments within a local authority. A question has come in about who makes the decision and who controls the curb. Interesting. Who provides the blue badge, who provides the business permits, who provides the carers permits, etc. So again, I think it's it seems on the surface something very easy, but actually when you have lots of different departments trying to cater for all their needs and their services, it becomes very complicated. James, what do you feel about a one permit fits all solution? Is that something that Unity 5 ZatPark is thinking of? Is that something we can do, you can do?
Well, it's a tough one. I think there are too many different permit types. I think there's too many different outcomes. You know, there's a lot of systems, there's a lot of car parking operators, and there's obviously a lot of local authorities as well. And there's, you know, to have that kind of one size fits all permit, it needs to be a lot of talking to each other, especially from a systems perspective. And that, you know, behind all of those systems talking to each other, there's a lot of agreements and, you know, processes that need to be changed. So I personally think we're quite a way away from it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, certain sectors can't do it. I would say it was a lot more easier in the private parking sector, and that's by being operator specific, because if you are an operator and you provide a, you know, one size fits all permit, that means you have access to all the sites under that operator, and that model is a lot easier to follow. Whereas if it's a local authority, for example, you know, you get your residential permits, you get your NHS permits, you get your all those different type of permit types, and they all follow different prices and locations, and you just having that one permit that works across all of them is not really going to be feasible. But it doesn't mean you can't make the process simpler.
Neil, I'm going to come to you in a second. James, just sort of follow on to that. Are there any authorities that you have worked with recently? I mean, one comes to mind that I think was with ZatPark, but it may have been in a previous life for me, where the local authority had 27 or 28 different permutations of permits, and all the costs associated with each permit and all the zones they were allowed in. Is that something that you and other software providers advise on? And if so, what is the advice? More, less?
Well,
I hope I know the answer.
there's a good answer to this. Now, local authorities, obviously, with older systems who haven't quite yet made that jump into a newer, more digitalized system, they will have a lot of strange processes and different permit types for all these different outcomes. And when they are looking for a new system, they will guess, look for the system to do it the same way they've always done it. The local authorities don't like change, it's as simple as that. But there are obviously certain areas where change is good, and changing even a small thing from a process just makes it a lot more streamlined and simpler. So yeah, from my experience with them, they're not necessarily bad ways of doing them, but they just need modernizing. They need to utilize the technology that's out there. And then, once you make that step, it's only going to get better. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. I agree. And Neil, if I'm driving into centre of Manchester as a delivery driver, would I need, or do you see the need to have a permit to park in the centre of Manchester to deliver? And then if I'm going off to Liverpool, do I need a separate? Does Grid enable you to have everything under one roof?
And this is where we get to the big point, which the DfT is trying to work towards with its national parking platform. There needs to be standardisation, interoperability, and to do what we're doing, which is for the service sector, the delivery servicing sector, they're going to want to integrate this with their routing and scheduling tools. So it needs to be a national approach, and with the local authorities buying in. But the benefits of having a digital solution is that there's no major infrastructure costs for implementation. It's quite straightforward to offer up the curb space, create a series of rules and protocols around who's going to be offered it at what time and at what rates, and then make that offer available digitally to the recipients of the information. And going back to the general point about the general notice, I think we're going to get to the stage where innovation and the market's going to drive this, because if I'm driving around, I just want my personal parking profile to consume whatever information is coming from the car park operators. If I drive past the NPR camera on private land, I don't want to find out that I've done that 2 weeks later with a £100 penalty. I want to find out immediately that I've driven past that and have a message to my phone through my profile to say, you've entered such and such a car park, those are the rules, would you like to pay through your payment process? And you tick yes. It needs to be simple. It needs to be carrot rather than stick driven, and getting the community to buy in, getting the public to buy in. And what we've got now is the commercial vehicle operators, the freight servicing and delivery sector wanting a solution, because some of the companies are now starting to refuse to take contracts in London because of the punitive cost of trying to do business at the curbside, and there's no enough parking provision, loading provision, and they're circling around, creating emissions, kicking out waste, driving extra miles. And there is a beneficial outcome for everybody by making the end destination bookable from a commercial vehicle perspective. Now, once we move on to electrification and upwards of 35 million vehicles who are going to need to be talking to an electric charging infrastructure, we need to get smart, and we need to get smart quite quickly. The local authorities have got to start to embrace the digitalisation of the traffic order process, curbside management process, because if you've got connected autonomous vehicles, they can't be talking to a PDF document in an archive. They have to be talking to a digitized curb space.
I'm not going to start talking to you about autonomous vehicles. We'll be here all day. We haven't got time for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to read out a statement from Rob. Thanks, Rob, for sending this in. But actually, it's really interesting, and then we'll come back to some questions. Rob has said digitalisation is most certainly the way forward. In Derby, we had some initial resistance, but with some nudging incentives, we are now 91% digital permits, and last month only produced 14 paper permits. Massive saving opportunities, as well as intelligence gathering on driver behaviour. Take the plunge. So thank you, Rob. I think actually most people would agree with you on that statement, but thank you for sending that in. I think actually a simple one, Tina, again, perhaps for you to start with, and maybe James. Does the V5C alone contain sufficient information to be a single document that proves an applicant meets the vehicle ownership and residency criteria? Thank you, John Barry, for sending that in. Tina, I think I know the answer, having had to send lots of stuff into many different local authorities over my time.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? The straightforward answer should be yes, it should be enough to prove that the vehicle is owned by the person who's applying for a permit. But in reality, there's probably a little bit more to it, isn't there? In that proves you've owned that vehicle, but a lot of the time the data's not up to date. You know, the amount of vehicles or the amount of DVLA checks that are done, you find that actually somebody's not updated their address and they're still a resident in a different zone somewhere else. So it should be straightforward that all you need is your logbook and a proof of ID. That should be it, really. And I'm not sure that in reality it works like that, and it certainly doesn't, because there's always exemptions, always. Or there's always a reason why somebody doesn't have that. But in a virtual world, you don't have as much conflict, I don't think, in that people accept that that's what they need to upload, and they tend to do that in the main. Whereas with a paper system, people are told what they need to provide, and they don't always accept that that is what they need to send in.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Thank you, James. In your experience, what are current ZatPark clients asking for as proof of ownership, ID, residency, etc.? What seems to be acceptable? What's the minimum that some of your clients are accepting?
Well, obviously, the most popular one is going to be the V5C. It is a legal document to declare who owns that vehicle, so that's going to be the first on everyone's list, really. Following that, you know, you often get your proof of residencies as well to confirm that, you know, your address matches, etc. And then it differs between different operators on what evidence needs to be provided. The fact that you just have the ability to ask for that evidence is good enough. I think that with a V5C, asking for it doesn't necessarily mean the V5C isn't enough. Yes, the data is sometimes out of date and it's not accurate. But then I think that's more of a problem with the way the V5Cs and all that operate. I think even that from the DVLA are so far behind. They could join this webinar and learn a few things from their V5C process. So I think as far as the V5C goes, that should be enough.
I'm not going to get into a DVLA bashing session. Well, I think we've all been doing that for certainly the 30 years I've been involved in this business. So, but thank you, James. Neil,
what I'm trying to say is essentially the V5C process being, dated, etc., is not any fault of anybody's within our sector.
Thank you, Neil. What's to stop me fraudulently saying that I'm a delivery driver and booking a nice curbside space through your application outside Kensington and Chelsea Town Hall and going off and having lunch?
Well, your V5C will tell me you're driving a Lotus Elise or something like that, or your Jag or whatever you've got, Gavin. And that'll throw that up as an anomalous booking. Okay,
so there are similar sort of checks around the immediate booking as there are for a permit, such as in Bury or London or somewhere like that.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a series of protocols that sit behind the scenes, operational behaviours that they have to adhere to as well to be able to use the scheme. So you're opting into an opt-in scheme where you're going to have preferred permission at the curb space through booking, which gives you better access to your servicing your customers.
And I would just like
to wait from you once you've got it.
No, thank you, Neil. I'd just like to point out that you obviously haven't been paying attention to anything I've said. I still have my old battered Land Rover. Travels with my Land Rover is going to be the title of my book, and I'm very upset about the new ULEZ. I completely forgot about it and got a £12 fine the other day. But anyway, we'll have I'm sure we'll have a webinar where I can have a moan about that sometime. We've had a question from Simon Chung. Nice to see you again, Simon. Will a national approach in all of this mean an end to local parking policy control? I suspect that's going to be for you, Tina, to start with.
Interesting. I'm not sure you can ever fully remove local legislation. Much as we would like to in some ways, I don't think you're ever going to see the end of that for a number of reasons, really. If you compare it to looking at, for example, parking enforcement, I know GM have been looking at a GM parking enforcement structure on and off the table for a number of years. And there's a reason that it's never got to a point where there is just one enforcement regime across the whole of GM. And that's because each district operates differently. They have different policies at a local level. They have different political powers. or oppositions at a local level. So I don't think that you will ever remove from a local level. I don't see how that would, how one approach fits all would work personally.
Okay. Neil, would you have a view on that, Neil? I mean, it's fine if you don't.
No, I've got a view on this because it falls then into the procurement barrier for many companies developing solutions like we're doing. If we have to go down the route of being procured each and every time by 250 plus local authorities, it becomes a barrier to adoption by the big fleet operators such as UPS, FedEx, DPD, because they want one system where they can access a booking platform to make the use of the curbside in a better way. So it can be done and adopted from a national framework, which makes procurement easier, but to do it on a procurement basis, individual basis, local authority, street by street, bay by bay, it'll take us 100 years to get to where we need to be. And what we're seeing is that the innovation and technology is happening overseas. But from the trade missions that you mentioned earlier on, Gavin, I've been around the world, and what every other country and every other city wants to see is a UK demonstrator so they can copy it. So the sooner we get these digital interventions out there and the adoption of the dynamic bookable curb space, and it can be for local authorities just to consume one little element. There might only be a problem in 2 or 3 areas of the high street. You don't need to buy a big solution for that. You just need to plug in a couple of locations to integrate into an application or a platform such as ours, and then you've got your solution, which is very, very light touch, but delivers big savings from the emissions perspective, air quality improvement, congestion reduction at the hotspot locations. And if we work everywhere backwards from the hotspots, the operators are getting tickets in the problem areas. They're quite prepared to book the curb space and pay for the curb space. So this is changing a positive carrot-led approach from an enforcement-driven approach. And when you've got companies delivering burgers to McDonald's and beer to pubs, they have to do that. And it's about what curbside permissions and hierarchies the authority can set to enable and facilitate that. Again, under the Road Traffic Regulation Act, there is a requirement for local authorities to encourage business-to-business activity. So it's about working within the rules that we have, working within the processes and defining the solutions, yes, on a hyper-local and a local basis, but within a national framework.
I do love the way that out the years we've been talking about this. What always comes to our mind about deliveries is beer and food first. Forget blood and things like that. I'm with you, Neil. I'm with you. I'm just saying I think it's very funny that we always talk about let's get the beer to the pubs sooner rather than later. I mean, just very quickly moving on from that, you just mentioned the TROs there. Again, I remember discussing with you, if I'm a local, and Tina perhaps will come to you after Neil, if I'm a local authority parking manager and I have my traffic regulation orders and I have a double yellow line and it's there for a reason, it's been there for 100 years, what incentive or how do they get around, and maybe Tina, this is for you to answer first, I'll leave it to you guys. How do they go around changing that and changing people's perception that that bit of yellow line can be used for something else and should be utilised for something else?
So if we work backwards from this, within the schedules, you can build in waivers and dispensations for certain types of vehicles to do certain things anyway. Or you can create new traffic orders, experimental ones, temporary ones. Or if you really want to bring in a new traffic order in a new scheme, you create a permit-only bay with a traffic order to allow permits to be used, and you describe the permits. Well, what we've got to is that there are certain industries, and I'll come back to the brewing industry because they have a health and safety driver which has criminal sanctions attached if you don't adhere to it. So they have to be adjacent to, and if they're on double yellow lines with curb blips where loading's prohibited, what we have to do is to look at the least fresh time to allow that vehicle to be there, so it least impacts on the network, because they have to be outside the cellar doors. And it's the same on the TLRN. That there are MOUs that exist with TfL for some of the operators that will allow them to effectively have curbside permission to engage in activities. The scaffolders have it, glaziers have it, cash in transit vehicles have it, and so does the brewing industry and some frozen and chilled. So the tools are there. The tools are there within the traffic process. What we need to get to as well is the ability to have the the ability to change dynamically what a piece of curb space is used for, and we've got some work to do from the central government perspective on that. But you want to be able to have the flexibility depending on local conditions and hyperlocal conditions, who can be where at the curbside, but change that dynamically in real time. So if there is no demand for loading on a morning, make it available for click and collect, for instance.
I tend to agree. I think it's a sort of similar principle you see of roadworks where nothing seems to happen for months, but half the lanes are blocked off. Tina, how would you put your project centre hat on, which obviously is your main hat? Is that something simple that local authorities can pick up, the changing adaptability of TROs?
I think it sounds more complicated than it is, and as Neil's just explained, you can, in your TRO, you can write that schedule so that it describes exactly what that curb space is going to be and how it can operate. Don't think that is the barrier. The barrier is from a local authority perspective and public perception, and how you get that message out to the public. I think it was James that said earlier that local authorities don't like change, and I think ultimately, I think most people don't like change. The public don't like change unless they understand what is happening with that change and they can see the benefits. And I think it's what needs to change is the education and the awareness. And you know, it's quite apt really, because if we think of TMA Part 6 that will be coming to fruition in the early new year, that is very similar. That will be a re-education for people of understanding, and that is what needs to happen in this scenario. We need to be more flexible with how the curb space is, and I think a lot of local authorities would agree with that, the concept of it. I don't think any of them have any problems with, probably. It's the reality of how you do that and how you make that smooth transition, and that probably comes back to one of my last slides, where it's about, are you clear in what your vision is, and are you communicating that? Are the public involved in that process, or are you telling them that this is what we're going to do? You need to take them on that journey, and they need to be involved in that, and they need to understand what the benefits are from that, not to be told this is what we're doing because this is good for you. It's about involving them and engaging them in that process from the start, and being able to do that. The TRO side of it is almost a paperwork exercise, and providing you get that correct, that's a very important part of the process, and you will need some guidance in being able to do that sometimes, and especially if it is something that's not been done before, and some local authorities can be quite nervous about that, and maybe don't understand what needs to be done for that to be able to ensure that they can enforce the end product of it. But ultimately, it's all about education, in my opinion. I think we need to be more flexible, but we need to do that in a way that engages people and people understand the benefits of it. They don't just see it appear and then have to understand how to use it.
Thank you very much.
That's precisely why we created the digital sign, the real-time sign, so that we can convey hyperlocal information. And the three-sided sign that we're building as well will have local community information on the other sides. So if you can imagine the very archaic suspended base signs, which are correct boards held up with pieces of wire and tape, we can turn that into a digital piece of information, a communication tool. Local COVID conditions, air quality, temperature, and QR codes that give local discounts as well. So you can start to turn the curbside into a real-time dynamic area.
Thank you. No, it's very interesting, both of you. We have time for maybe one, maybe two questions, but this one is definitely for James, because it says for James on it. Thank you, Caroline. We have some really complex sites where virtual whitelist is really difficult because of a variety of times they want to give visitors access to parking, i.e. 20 minutes, 1 hour, etc. And normally at short notice, which makes the management of a virtual whitelist difficult, and paper visitor passes currently work best. James, what solutions can ZatPark offer that we might not be aware of? Do you want a minute to think about that while I ask?
No, not necessarily. There's a number of different products or technologies available. I mean, first things first, if paper works and they've got no interest to change it, then that's where it's going to be. But looking at ways, you know, things that you can implement, you could look at introducing a tablet, a kiosk, and within that kiosk you'd have those different parking durations, and then they are just responsible for obviously putting their registration on the kiosk, selecting the relevant time that they are wishing to park, and then just submitting that. Once that kiosk has a stable internet connection, it's going to push it through to the active whitelist, and then obviously have their authorized parking session. The other way you can do it is, well, certainly what we offer is obviously our ZatPermit solution, where they can essentially log on into an account and then select the relevant tariff. Now, again, that can state the relevant parking duration, whether it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, and they can simply select the relevant one, follow it through. So whether they go through whether they need to upload any questionnaires or anything like that. And then once that has been authorized, if it does require an approval, if not, brilliant, it will just go straight onto the whitelist, and then they have that ability to park there for that duration. Now, the kiosk one sounds better, going into the premise and just putting the registration in with the duration, but depending on obviously the complexity of the site, depends on what solution will best be available. I mean, absolutely more than welcome to take a further look into what we can provide for things like this outside of the webinar. But by the sounds of it, there are solutions out there, and certainly things that will help with the complex up.
Thank you. I'm being told to wind up now, and I guess I'll do that. I think the thing that I will take most from this, and I think Tina summed it up very well, is actually taking people on a journey. And a lot of the messages that are coming through as opposed to questions and by that I mean, I think, Tina, you mean the public, but also the local authorities, also the businesses, Neil, and making sure that we're not just, as an industry, we're not just forcing people to do something without any explanation, etc. I'm very pleased to hear about the social inclusion, and that Darby was talking about switching to digital permits and having very few paper permits still issued. So as a technically challenged old age person, I think you called me, James, I'm very pleased that things are becoming easier. But we'll talk about your comments when I see you next week. There's certainly no beer for you. So I'd also probably just like to take this opportunity, and I'm sure Landor won't hate me for it, just to promote the Traffic and Parking Conference and Exhibition on the 30th of November. And Neil, I presume you will be there?
I'll be there, yes.
Fantastic, always good to see you. And Tina, I know either you or certainly I think you're going to be there, but the project centre will be represented. Adam will be up there along with Keith Hanshaw, etc.
Yeah.
And I do know that ZatPark, certainly myself, James, and a few others will be out there exhibiting. So please do sign up for the Traffic and Parking Conference in Manchester. I think it's a Manchester Conference Centre. Hopefully Tina's nodding at me. Great. So just sort of remains me to thank the panelists, Tina, Neil, and James. Very informative. Thank you very much for sparing some time yesterday and obviously today to get this out to people. We've had some really good questions. We've also had some amazing attendance. So thank you very much. Cameras will be then turned off, and we will never see each other again till the end of the month. And I'd just like to thank Landor and ZatPark for sponsoring this. I hope you all have a very good rest of your day, and we'll see you at the end of November.